Shalom TV's coverage of the 2014 AIPAC Policy Conference is made possible in part by Naomi Vilko, MD, in memory of her father, William Vilko, and in memory of her other relatives who perished in the Shoah.
So Ari, let's start with you. First of all, thank you so much for being here. We know that you were in the midst of a whirlwind international speaking tour as part of your new book, My Promised Land.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations, really. Congratulations on a fantastic work and a fantastic launch. What would you say is the general Israeli attitude about the peace process in this moment, given the checkered past of negotiations? Are Israelis too scarred by past deals in which they've made irreversible concessions in return for not much? Or have Israelis shown a willingness and a readiness to return to that path with renewed, if cautious, optimism?
Great complex question, calls for a long, complex answer. And I always like complexity, as I always say, if you are to say anything sincere and realistic about the Middle East or the conflict or about the country we love so much, it's always complex. Anything that is simple is wrong. So complexity is good, a good beginning. But again, as I turned into a kind of amateur historian, I cannot answer the part about the present without getting to what you touched about, which is the past. So if you'll allow me a few minutes, I'll try to say where things are. The first thing to remember is a surprising thing, which is how much Israel swung dramatically to the left. Usually, definitely if you read the media in this country, in Europe, you think that Israel has become a very right-wing conservative country. And there is some truth in it in some way. But the truth of the matter is that if you look at our position regarding the conflict and the possible peace deal, we changed dramatically to the left. What happened is that in 1993, we recognized the Palestinian people is there and it has legitimate rights, something that was a taboo before. And the Palestinians to this day did not recognize there is a Jewish people, before Jewish state, there is a Jewish people with legitimate rights in the region, in the country. Then in 2000, in the Camp David Peace Summit, we accepted the idea that there should be a Palestinian state. We were willing to give back 100% of the Gaza Strip and 95% of the West Bank, and divide Jerusalem. So Israel officially broke all its old taboos and swung to the left. You want a proof of that? Benjamin Netanyahu, the right-wing leader of Israel's right-wing government, the son of Professor Ben-Zion Netanyahu, Jabotinsky's secretary, is today much further to the left than Yitzhak Rabin when assassinated. Not only the old Yitzhak Rabin. Yitzhak Rabin, the peacenik Yitzhak Rabin of Oslo, was not willing to have a Palestinian state. He was playing with the idea of Medina minus, state minus. He was not willing to divide Jerusalem, and he demanded the entire Jordan Valley. So I do not know what's really Netanyahu's heart and where is he heading. But when you look at his formal statements, expressed in three major speeches, the Bar Ilan speech, his famous speech he gave in the Knesset, and his speech in the Congress, you have a position is to the left of Yitzhak Rabin. If Benjamin Netanyahu was today a minister in Golda Meir's government, he would have been fired out of her government as a lefty. The positions he holds today are the positions of Moked, which was a 2% left-wing party. So this is where Israel stands, and people do not give Israel the credit for that, and it calls why. So this is number one. Israel, in principle, swung to the left. But Israelis are traumatized. Why are Israelis traumatized? Because Middle Israel, the Israeli center, opened its heart to peace 4 times. In 1993, we signed Oslo, and in 1994, May 1994, Yasser Arafat arrives in Gaza. Now, I'm a great admirer of America, and I never criticize America, but I do not remember that America came to terms with Fidel Castro in the way that we came to terms with Yasser Arafat. Arafat was 100 times more demonic and more dangerous psychologically to us than Castro was. And we overcame that and brought him to Gaza. 5 months later, first bus explodes in Dizengoff Street. But we do not give up. A year and a half later, we pull out of the West Bank cities, Ramallah, Jenin, Nablus, Hebron. 2 months later, a wave of terror in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem which killed 60 Israelis. We don't give up. In 2000, Ehud Barak goes to Camp David and does what I just said, breaks every Israeli taboo. The result, the worst terror offensive ever in our history, and one of the worst terror offensive any democracy experienced. With suicide bombing is a terrible phenomenon, surrealistic reality. I cannot forget the moment my own cafe in Jerusalem was bombed. I cannot forget the sight of the handsome boys and girls sitting in a bombed-up bar at night. There was literally blood in the streets. It was so horrific. To this day, I think Israelis did not overcome the trauma of those years, of 2002. But we don't give up. Comes Ariel Sharon, the warrior, the great brutal general, and pulls out of Gaza. Not one settlement remains. Not one checkpoint remains. Is there a Palestinian Singapore as a result? There is a Hamas-dominated Gaza that is a rocket base that attacks southern Israel. So 4 times, this Israeli center, these reasonable Israelis, who are not absolute peaceniks, but they're not absolute nationalists, they're somewhere in the middle. They want to move on with their life. They open their hearts, they go for peace, and the result is catastrophic. So what you have in Israel is this terrible gap. We are locked between the willingness in principle to go for peace, to pay extraordinary prices, and the feeling that there is no one there, that whenever we try it, we get burned. On top of this comes the Arab chaos, previously referred by the American media as the Arab Spring. And what you see, nothing is stable. You cannot trust anything. It's all in a flux. So Israelis are caught in a terrible psychological situation where they are willing to move forward. I'm talking about 60, 70%. But the traumas of the 4 failures in the past and the chaotic region paralyzes them. What do they go for? Escapism. They decide to ignore the Middle East and to ignore the problem, the Palestinian issue, this way or the other. And they totally concentrate on social issues, which are very important. But in the last elections in 2013 in Israel were crazy elections. How do I know that? Because Iran was much more of an issue in your presidential elections of 2012 than it was an issue in the Israeli elections of 2013. That's crazy. Mm-hmm. So we are basically in a situation where you have willingness, trauma, the result being we are psychologically paralyzed. We are into kind of trying to ignore the problem. And the only change that I see in the last few months is that because of the American pressure and because BDS began penetrating people's mind, they're beginning to be afraid of international pressure. So they are not into making peace with our neighbors because they don't have belief in it. But they realize that Israel must do something to avoid being totally delegitimized. But that's too weak. That's not, there is no full understanding of the problem. We are not addressing it. And we are caught actually in this psychological catch that is the result of 2 decades of failed peace attempts.
Right. Well, we'll have time to delve into. We'll hopefully have time to delve into a lot of what you touched upon a lot more deeply throughout the course of the discussion. But Natan, I want to turn to you. You too have written about a kind of collective national scarring of a kind, the generational scar that was left by the Second Intifada imprinted upon the Israeli public. What is the psychological state, if you will, of the Israeli people as they entered into and participate in the current round of negotiations? And is there trust enough to make for a viable process?
I'm not sure there is. And part of what the Second Intifada did was convince Israelis that all rules have been broken. What happened, what Ali talked about, the sense in Israel was that simply everything that had been built suddenly collapsed. So people talk about Camp David and Arafat's position in Camp David as the end of the sense of a two-state solution, but it really was the war, the Second Intifada, that followed very shortly. The feeling that Barak, whether it was a very generous offer or whatever, it was a genuine offer. It was sincere. He came to try and negotiate. And the response was a horrific wave of violence. And a wave of violence that touched Israelis in a way that 73 with all the trauma didn't, and many things since, really almost since 48, 49, where the streets of Israel themselves were the battleground. And like Ali, the cafe he's talking about is the neighborhood I grew up. And it really, it felt a situation where every single street is the forefront. What that did in politics is a well-known thing. When people come into political consciousness, that is often where their politics are framed. So somewhere in the late teens, early 20s, a lot of people's conceptions of what politics are cemented, and they rarely change later. So you have a generation of Israelis right now who have come out of that, of the long years of the Second Intifada, of a sense of there is no one to talk to, and moreover, no desire to think of them in the ways that in the 90s most Israelis wanted to. And a sense of that the options facing Israelis have to do with us. So we can unilaterally move, which was shortly after the Second Intifada. Ariel Sharon moves to a unilateral approach. Okay, we'll just take care of ourselves. We have no one to talk to. Arafat dies, but even Abu Mazen, we can't talk to him. We'll take care of ourselves. And then a sense that Gaza, instead of Singapore, becomes a base for rockets. So every single option that Israel's tried, not only the peace talks, but unilateralism, or just ignoring the problem, everything comes up against the wall. So we talk a lot about the peace process right now, especially because it's ongoing and it's D-Day to a certain degree. But really the acute issue that we're not discussing is the status quo, is what's plan B? What happens if there is no deal? And if the common perception among most Israelis is right, which is we want peace but we can't do it, what do we do next? And the option of delegitimization is real, but it's a terrible one. A status quo is not static. What's happening in the territories is not static. And so there's a very deep dilemma, a conundrum, something that's not solved in the minds of Israelis. And I think this is at the core of what Ali described as escapism. This is why Israelis, there is simply no answer. And it's a very difficult situation. It's more difficult than sometimes Israelis give it credit for, in a sense. But this chance of peace, on the other hand, there still is one. So I'm going to, taking back a bit what I said, if you look at the polls on both sides, actually, there is basically a willingness to sign a deal, but there's also a complete distrust that the other one is serious about it. But if you pose the question slightly differently, my colleague at Brookings, Shavit did an in-depth poll about this. If you say, if the other side has signed on, would you say yes? And the majorities in favor grow considerably. Suddenly you've solved a central dilemma of both sides of is there even a deal? Similarly, if you break down each of the issues, are you willing to negotiate? If you ask Palestinians, are you willing to negotiate on the right of return, on this and that? They'll say no, 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 no. If you say, and here's the whole package, and it recognizes X, Y, and Z, and the Israelis accept it, suddenly something shifts. Mirror image of that is true of Israelis. They don't trust the Palestinians on Jerusalem. They don't trust them on the Jordan Valley. They don't trust on anything else. But if a full package came through, then the Israelis, as Ali said, have moved so far from the left, and say in the 80s, when I was going to the military, that everything was right versus left. That has completely changed.
Right, those polls that you referenced, that a majority of both the Israeli public and the Palestinian public support a two-state solution, but a majority also believe that a deal is unlikely, if not impossible, in the near term. And so, David, I'd like to...
Smart majority.
majority tends to rule. David, so I'd like to turn to you for a few minutes to talk about the Palestinian side of that equation. You recently undertook an exhaustive survey of incitement amongst the Palestinians. Talk to us for a few minutes about the current state of Palestinian incitement, in the degree, the kind, implications for the two-state solution ultimately, and how real that reported Palestinian support for a two-state solution can truly be, given that incitement that the Palestinian public is subjected to on a daily basis.
Okay, thanks for the question. It is an exhaustive and exhausting study. I'm going to just wave it at you. If you want to read the whole text, it's on the Washington Institute website, www.washingtoninstitute.org. And it's called Beyond Words, Causes, Consequences, and Cures for Palestinian Authority Hate Speech. So I'm going to try in just a few minutes summarize some of my findings and talk about the implications for Israeli public opinion and for the peace process as a whole. The way I see it, the Palestinians, I'm talking now about the Palestinian Authority only, not about Hamas in Gaza. That's completely beyond the pale. They completely reject Israel's existence, the idea of peace with Israel, not talking about them. I'm focused only on the official Palestinian government under Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah, in the West Bank. The partners, or the supposed partners for peace with Israel that are sitting down in peace talks with Israel right now. That Palestinian government, in my view, in their own words, is delivering a very mixed message every day. To their own people, to Israelis, to Americans, to the outside world. The mixed message is that on the one hand, they are talking officially about a two-state solution, about living side by side in peace with Israel. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, every day, unfortunately, the official Palestinian media promotes the idea that the Palestinians still have a claim to Haifa and Jaffa and Akko and Nazareth and a whole host of other cities, formerly majority Palestinian cities or parts of historic Palestine that are inside pre-1967 Israel, not in the West Bank or Gaza or someplace else, but in Israel. Those messages appear on official Palestinian media, whether it's their newspapers, their ceremonies, their songs, their maps, their websites, their Facebook pages, and so on, every single day. And every day, or almost every day, official Palestinian media, and even Mahmoud Abbas himself, talks about terrorists that Israel released from prison in order to get the peace talks going as, quote, heroes, unquote, as, quote, role models for the future generation, unquote. That's what terrorists are called by official Palestinian government media. It gets worse. Because on some official Palestinian media, for example, the Facebook pages of some Palestinian government, I emphasize, government high schools in the West Bank, or in children's magazines published by the Palestinian Authority and required reading for kids in Palestinian public schools in the West Bank, you can find, in the last few years, you can actually find, and I document this here with pictures, you can find tributes to Adolf Hitler and statements arguing that the Holocaust was either invented or it was a good thing. So, what we have is, I want to emphasize, not a single message of hatred and enmity, but a mixed message, a double message. And Israelis, especially people in the Israeli government who pay very close attention to this, I don't think that the Israeli public is all that aware of this issue, but people in the Israeli government who pay very close attention to this make the case that as long as the Palestinians continue to deliver this kind of mixed message, they cannot be a true partner for peace, that Israel cannot trust their ultimate intentions, and that Israel therefore cannot take the risk of making the kinds of concessions that would be required in order to get a compromise, which many Israelis support in principle, if there is a partner, a genuine partner on the other side, that Israel cannot take the risk of making those concessions as long as this incitement and hate speech continues. What is the remedy or the antidote for this poisonous discourse? Well, for one thing, in my view, the Palestinians and President Abbas himself could stop doing this in a minute if that's what they decided to do. It's not complicated. I agree with Ari that complexity is often the truth and is important. This is not a complicated issue. Mahmoud Abbas, tomorrow, if he wanted to, could say, stop calling terrorists heroes on my official television. He could do it, but he's not doing it. He could tell Palestinian television, stop calling Haifa and Jaffa Palestinian cities that belong to us, if he wanted to do that, but he's not doing it. So that's one thing that could be done. But there's another, more positive side to this story, and very briefly, I will tell you what I think it is. If he's unwilling, or perhaps in his own mind, unable to stop this kind of discourse, negative messages to his own people, perhaps he could provide some positive messages, Abbas I'm talking about, and his government, not just to Israelis or Americans, to whom he often talks about he doesn't really want to exercise personally the right of return to his hometown of Safed, Tzfat in Israel, or he really does want peace and he really does recognize the Jewish connection to the historic land of Israel. That's what he says to Americans or to Israelis. He could say that to his own people in Arabic. And sometimes, to be fair, sometimes he does. Sometimes, for example, when he spoke or when he was interviewed on Arab television, and I listened to this stuff in Arabic to make sure I know what's really being said. He said to a reporter, an Arab TV reporter, who asked him, do you support boycotts against Israel? He said, no, we don't. We oppose boycotts against Israel. So I go to other audiences in Europe or in the United States. Somebody mentioned, you did, Natan, the BDS movement, or you did, Ari, as one of the factors that is beginning to seep into Israeli public consciousness. And I say to these audiences, if Mahmoud Abbas, the president of Palestine, is against boycotts of Israel, why are you for it? I don't get a good answer to that question. But one thing that Abbas could say that would really make a difference to Israeli public opinion, and we know this from actual surveys that I've done in Israel and among the Palestinians and that other people have done. One thing that he could say is to say that the Palestinians will recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Whether you agree with that demand or not, whether you even understand what it really means for Israel to be a Jewish state or not, if the Palestinian government were willing to say that, it would instantaneously produce a 15-point jump in the percentage of the Israeli public that would be willing to accept the establishment of a Palestinian state, more or less, on the 1967 lines. A 15-point jump. Anyone who studies public opinion or who works on political campaigns will tell you that that is a fantastic advantage. If you can get 15% of the other side to switch over to favor your position just by saying something, Jewish state, you should do it.
Great, so let's segue then into a conversation about Prime Minister Netanyahu's demand that the Palestinians recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Critics have called this unnecessary, some have called it nonsense, some have gone so far as to suggest that it's a gratuitous demand just to make it such that a resolution won't ultimately be possible. At the same time, a recent Peace Index poll shows that 77% of the Jewish Israeli public believes that the Palestinians must recognize Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in any final agreement. So, Ari, talk to us a little bit about why this demand seems to be so widely supported amongst the Israeli public, despite the poo-pooing of others.
First of all, it's a new thing that it's supported. I'll get into that in a minute. Have a long history with this issue, and I'd love to share it with you. I think it's interesting, but I must refer to something you
Please.
said. I never had, or definitely for 20 years, I didn't have illusions about Mr. Abbas, and I was very skeptic about the Palestinian political culture and all what you described. I think there's a lot of poison there, and we have to expose it and to deal with it. But there's an important but. When we say that they talk about Jaffa and Haifa, aren't some of our ministers talking about Hebron and Nablus?
Mm-hmm. Not
when we
Shechem.
and aren't when we say that they do not accept Israel in the pre-67 lines, aren't we building houses and settlements all over the 22% that they are supposed to have if there's a two-state solution? So, if we want to make the case for Israel, if we want to be effective Zionists in a new and somewhat hostile world, we must capture the moral high ground. Whenever we lost the moral high ground, we lost the war, not only public opinion. We had trouble. The 73 war went so bad. After in 72 we were offered peace and we rejected it, and then the war went bad. In 81, when we were not willing to move, the 82 war was a horrific war. In 86, when we were not taking the London Peace Initiative, came the Intifada, which caused us terrible damage. And the other way around. We won the 1948 war that was so heroic and difficult, and we lost 1% of our population. Imagine 3.5 million Americans getting killed in less than a year. We survived through that terrible war, and we won because before the war we were willing to divide the land, and we accepted the UN resolution. And we had the moral high ground towards the international community and towards ourselves. Every decent person in the world knew that we wanted peace, and our hand was rejected. And every Israeli who had to go and risk his life knew that he was risking his life for a government and policy that was willing to try peace, but when confronted with war was as tough as nails. And the same was in 2000. People do not give Ehud Barak, and by the way, Bill Clinton, the credit. Their failed peace summit saved us in the Second Intifada. If we had gone into the Second Intifada without the peace Camp David and the Camp David, we would have thought that it's about occupation and settlements. And Ehud Barak and Bill Clinton saved us, because when violence struck, we knew that we were just. We knew we tried peace, and therefore we had the force to deal with war. In recent years, although I described the way we moved to the left, our policy is so ambiguous. We are not proving to the world and to ourselves that we are turning every stone in order to reach peace. I'm skeptical whether peace is there. I'm really skeptical. I have no illusions about the Palestinians, and nothing of what you described surprises me. But where's the moral high ground? In order to expose the fact that they are the wrong party, we have to prove that we are serious about the two-state solution. And this is essential for, again, I'm not sure that this will bring us peace, but I'm sure that this is essential to maintain Zionism and to ensure the future of the Jewish state, which leads me to your point. I was really the odd guy out among my friends in the center-left and left in Israel. From the day the Oslo Accord were published, I supported the Oslo idea, the negotiations with the PLO, the two-state solution, adamantly. And when the news of Oslo came, I was as happy as for 48 hours. When I read the text of the Oslo Accord, I was shocked. Because I said, how is it that they are trying to end the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, between the Jewish National Liberation Movement and the Palestinian National, without the word Jewish appearing in the text? How can it be that the word Jewish is not there? And I've become obsessive with this issue. And I kept writing about it and telling all my friends in the Israeli left, you cannot expect to have peace if there isn't a recognition of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And when some of my friends on the left went to do the Geneva Peace Initiative, they were shocked to discover how difficult it is to extract this recognition from the Palestinians. So here is why I so strongly support Benjamin Netanyahu. I don't want to sound vain, but I was 10 years ahead of Netanyahu on this. So I didn't need his lead on this. I'll tell you why I think it's so deep and needed. Because I so much support it. The conflict between us and the Palestinians is not about settlements and occupation. And just don't get too excited because I oppose settlement and occupation.
And
but this is not.
The
But this is what not this. The conflict is about the fact that we would not recognize they are a people. By the way, in the beginning they were not a people, but they turned to a people and we didn't recognize it. And they never recognized the fact that we are a people, that there is a Jewish people that has legitimate rights, including the right to self-determination in the land of Israel. And part of it, to argue as much as you watch about where the border should be. They never saw us and never recognized it. They were never willing to accept the Jewish state, and we were not willing to accept the Palestinian state. Now, as I said before, first of all, on this level, you cannot, when this is the conflict, you cannot claim to have peace when they do not recognize the fact that we are a people, a legitimate people, that we have a right of a state of our own, that must be democratic and respect the rights of all its citizens and have religious freedom. Now, don't distort the idea of Jewish, but they must recognize it. Without that, if a person doesn't really shake your hand, if it cannot call you really by your name, what sort of peace is it? So perhaps it's all kinds of things that are good, but it's not peace. So if you want real peace, it must be there. That's number one. Number two, as I said, we did go through the conversion because the cumulative effect of 1993 in Oslo and 2000 is that we recognize there is a Palestinian people and that should have a Palestinian state. Is it a war crime to demand that they'll do the same? That they'll recognize the Jewish people that has a right for it? Where's the war crime here? That's number two. Number three, any peace agreement between us, the Palestinians, is by definition almost unilateral. We give, they take. They don't have things to, we transfer assets to them. The one thing they can really give us is legitimacy. The one thing. So if, there is no deal where one side pays a lot and the other side doesn't. If the one thing that they can pay back with is this. So in principle, for the structure of a reasonable deal, they must do this because I agree it's painful for them. Yes, it's so painful for us to retreat because it is our ancient homeland. These are places that are holy for us, that are ours in many ways. We are willing to retreat. You do go through the pain of recognizing it. But the fourth reason, and in some ways perhaps the most important, because I do not see the Palestinians getting rid of all their poison immediately. If we want to have peace, even a real peace, even in long term, I want every Palestinian boy and girl in the Dahisha refugee camp to know the Jews are part of the land, that we've not come from Mars, that we are not colonizers, that we belong and we have rights there. And perhaps we have a bitter history, we have arguments about the border, but we are part of the land. If they don't know that, there is no chance for real peace even in 50 years' time. So the beginning, the seeds of peace are the recognition of the Palestinians, of the Jewish people, its rights in the Holy Land, and its right to have a legitimate Jewish state.
Natan, please.
I agree completely that to get peace, to get actual reconciliation, this is what's needed. And that's part of why it's so strong among the Israeli public. You speak to Israelis all the time about their vision of the future, of long-term future, and it rests upon the idea of legitimacy of the Zionist claim. But I'd like to point out that there are two very different paradigms that we're talking about. One, in a sense, is pre-2000, pre the Second Intifada and pre the sense of failure of Oslo. And that was a very different one. It was called a peace process. But to a large degree, as Ali alluded to in even the text of Oslo, it was not about peace or reconciliation. It wasn't about a marriage. It was about a divorce. And for many people on the left, this is the vision. It's not a vision of reconciliation between two peoples. It's of accommodation between two very conflicting narratives that deeply dislike each other. And so for many people behind that notion of settlement, it's not exactly peace, of divorce, amicable or otherwise divorce, the idea is not that we would even accept that Hebron is not ours or that they would accept that Jaffa is not theirs, but that we would live to disagree. We would agree to disagree and somehow get along, and hopefully down the line something would get a bit better. What Ali is talking about, and what Netanyahu has spoken about for a long time, even before also, and we should give him credit for that, is about peace, is about something much deeper, and that's reconciliation. For that, there needs to be a recognition on both sides. It includes Israelis talking about settlements and occupation, etc., and about the fact that Hebron will not be part of Israel, which Netanyahu does not do. But it definitely includes the Palestinians stopping this conversation that David described. The problem, and I harp back to this issue of Plan B, if peace is not achievable in the near future, as I suspect, and I think Ari thinks, and I would agree, and most Israelis and Palestinians think, if we cannot get true reconciliation and peace soon, where do we go? And I don't think it's an easy answer. I'm not here to preach for an answer. But it is a very difficult question that we in Israel and in the United States like to avoid because it's very uncomfortable. Unilateralism seems to have failed. This divorce idea doesn't seem to be available. And any other option seems to be very unpalatable. For example, continuation of military rule in the West Bank for another 46 years. So, if deep reconciliation and peace are not possible, we might have to think about divorce. Uncomfortable divorce with people who have vile speech without necessarily recognizing all what they want, but with getting much less than we would like, not necessarily for everything they would have gotten for a peace deal, perhaps for much less than that, but one that would, in a sense, unilaterally extract us from the moral low ground that Ali was talking about. Because if we find ourselves in a situation, and as a side note, this is the likely reality, where we cannot achieve real reconciliation soon, are we really dooming ourselves to continuing the current status quo, which is not static, the condemnation in the world, the debate about how many houses we're building inside those 22% that we're saying we're going to give up? Is that really where we want to be? And I would just say as an aside, unilateralism is out of favor in Israel. I'm not sure that will always be the case. It may very well be that Israelis have to take dramatic action if real peace, reconciliation is not available.
I have to say that you would think that unilateralism would be dead as a paradigm after what we saw happen in Gaza, after Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. But making the rounds in Israel, you can't help but stay away from these unilateral ideas that keep getting thrown into the mix. Naftali Bennett talking about withdrawing from select parts of the West Bank and taking control of others. Asher Susser at Tel Aviv University and Ehud Yaari talking about a kind of coordinated unilateralism, which is a pseudo-unilateralism. We can couch it in whatever terms we want, but in a way, it's still unilateralism. So is unilateralism dead as a paradigm, or do we still have that irresistible temptation to try as best we can to take matters into our own hands? I'd love to hear from each of you on that. David, please.
Well, my own view is that it's not a good idea, because it gives up something for nothing. And the results have not been good. Not in Lebanon, not in Gaza, not anywhere. And I also do think that there is a better alternative. That is to make the peace talks succeed. And I think that it's easy enough for Israel to, or some Israelis, or some people on the outside, like me, to talk about Israeli unilateralism. But I think the real problem is Palestinian unilateralism, because what many people among the Palestinians, and including possibly, we don't really know for sure, possibly President Abbas, think is that the Palestinians in the long run, may be able to get a lot of what they want with their own unilateral actions and policies, going to the United Nations, going to the international community to delegitimize Israel and to put pressure on Israel in order to get Israel to withdraw from the West Bank or major parts of it without the Palestinians having to concede peace and end of conflict, let alone real reconciliation. So I think unilateralism on either side is a recipe not for resolving, certainly, and probably not for mitigating the conflict or for maintaining or regaining the moral high ground, but for disaster, for continued conflict, for murky, blurry, very unsatisfactory moral discussions and with real-world implications in terms of the economy and in terms of Israel's international legitimacy and so on. I would avoid unilateralism like the plague if it were up to me. But I do want to say one small thing about Palestinian public opinion. I know this panel is supposed to be about Israeli public opinion, but what the Palestinians think also matters a great deal. And Israelis should know about it because it will help shape their view, I think, of what's going on the other side and how they should respond to it or take the initiative in addressing it. If you ask Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, I'm not talking about all the refugees in the diaspora and so on, but if you ask Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinian pollsters have asked this question, would you accept the recognition of Israel as a Jewish state if that were part of a package that brought an independent Palestinian state into existence? The answer that Palestinians give to that question by 60% majority consistently is yes, okay, we're willing to do it. So in my view, this is a significant and actually modestly encouraging data point about Palestinian public opinion, and I wish that the Palestinian government paid as much attention to its own public opinion on this point as I wish that the Israeli government paid as much attention to its own public opinion on other issues involved in the peace process.
All right, please weigh in here.
If I may, David, I want, although I mean, your points are totally valid and make a lot of sense.
I know there's a but coming.
They're big but.
And,
big but.
it's and.
Okay, big but.
Or at the same time.
Right. And I don't, there's so much to say about that, I really don't know where to begin. The beginning is that, talking of complexity, all options are bad. All options are bad. I mean, of course, the great option is peace. By the way, probably most people in the whole will not be willing to pay the price of peace, if there is. But even people are willing, we all have doubts whether it's possible. And first of all, from my point of view, it's our obligation, political duty and moral duty. As I say, b'chol dor v'dor, kol memshala v'memshala. Every Israeli government has to reach out its hand and try peace. Because I might be a skeptic, your data is skeptical, I might be wrong. And we cannot, it's our duty to go the Clinton parameters, the Barak, the Olmert plan, the Tzipi, the Kerry, take what you want. But take one of these, and I always say, if I had been Israel's prime minister, the first thing I'll do is I'll take the Olmert plan, which I'm not enthusiastic about. I'll give it to Yossi Beilin, and I'll say, Yossi, dear Yossi, you have 6 months. Bring this signed. I want to see Abbas once signing something. He promised so many times, I never saw his signature. So bring this signed. But if he does not come, if it is not signed, then what do we do? And then all options are bad, because the present situation is unbearable. Unilateralism is problematic, and this is why we are so paralyzed. So here, let me go one by one. First of all, the trauma, the great trauma. Let's talk of the two Israeli unilateral withdrawals. The unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon gave us enough international legitimacy to use overwhelming force in the Second Lebanon War 2006, and yet have the support of the entire world. The fact that we handled it badly between our government and our military, that's another issue. But talking of strategic terms, the withdrawal, the unilateral withdrawal worked, because when we were attacked in the 67 lines, the world was behind us. And we could have used our force in a very aggressive way to defend our borders. Number one, Gaza. Gaza is not great. It's not. The great mistake of Gaza is that Sharon did not say to the Israeli public to begin with that it's not a dream story, it's not a walk in the park, but it's a blood, sweat, and tears operation. Because it was a bad choice then. We, in my mind, have proved we are better off without controlling 1.8 million Palestinians in Gaza. We proved that we can deal with the security problem. With the demography and moral problem, we cannot deal. So Gaza is not a success, I agree, and I'll get to, but it's not such an overwhelming failure. The failure is just that we should have told the public to begin with, look, this is not going to be a rose garden. But it's better to have a line of conflict that is legitimate with a massive Jewish majority than to be bogged down in a situation that is unsustainable. That was the mistake. Talking of Sharon. Sharon, again, the warrior, the aggressive person, realized in 2003, 2004, that the dynamics of the world are going against us. And if we do not turn the dynamics, we'll be slaughtered. His term was koralis. He thought of the sheep going to the slaughter. So he looked at what is possible, what's a reasonable price to say that will not risk Israel, but will change world dynamics. And this is exactly the point, and it leads me to your point. This is not something for nothing. This is something for our legitimacy. Our legitimacy problem is our most acute strategic problem at the moment. We do not have serious military threats now in the Middle East. We have Hezbollah, it's a problem, but the rest of the threats that we faced of Arab armies invading us are gone. As I like to say, we do not have an F-15 problem. We have the problem that our F-15s might not be able to take off because the world will not let them take off. So we need to do something dramatically, quickly to reposition ourselves. Sharon, the brutal warrior, understood that. He could not express the words international legitimacy, but he got it in a kind of intuitive genius. And he did something about it, and he gained international legitimacy. So this is what it is there. It's not about peace between us and the Palestinians, which I'm skeptic about. It's about peace between us and the West, peace with us and America, peace between us and large parts of the American Jewish community, peace between us and young American Jews. For all that, we need to have, as I said, the moral high ground, and we have to take action. Now, let me get to the optimistic part of the analysis. Things are much better in potential than they were in Gaza. Why? Because while there's the bad news about the West Bank, there's a lot of good news. There are constructive Palestinian forces. I have no illusions about what they mean in the long term. But there are so many middle-class Palestinians who want to move on with their lives. That's number one. Number two, our Sunni neighbors, our moderate Sunni neighbors, who are desperate about Tehran, about the Islamic Brotherhood, and about Washington, are actually trying to work with us. They don't have enough legitimacy to go for a grand peace deal, but they would support a process of change on the ground. So, and you mentioned people talking about in the past. I hate to talk about my past. I wrote a book about this 9 years ago, in 2005. If you develop a sophisticated, coordinated unilateralist process, which is cautious, gradual, and creative. You don't go to the 67 line, you don't do it overnight. You try bit by bit, small pull-outs in which rawabis are being built, in which there is a real new Palestinian life developing, with the support of the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, with the support of the international community. I think you give the best answer for Israel's legitimacy problem, while feeding the potential alliance of the moderates in the Middle East and creating a new kind of reality. If we do not take that, we will face one of the two. either an imposed agreement, which will be very dangerous, a world turning its back again to us in a very dangerous way, or a situation where we really deteriorate towards a one-state situation on the ground, which is the worst of them all. So unilateralism is problematic, yes. If we do it in a smart way and take advantage of the new possibilities in the region, we can come up with something that is the lesser evil of all the choices facing us.
Great. David, did you want to respond to that?
Okay.
And then Natan will finish with you, and then we'll move to the audience, because I know you have a lot of questions, too.
To me, the essence of this debate is, and it is a real debate. I think we really have a difference of view here. I'm not trying to disguise it, but the essence of it is there a better alternative? And I think there is. The better alternative is the peace process.
Oh, I suppose.
And okay, so
we're all in.
So maybe we don't really disagree. Okay. I think Israel should do everything it can within reason and with its security paramount to make the peace process succeed and to demonstrate to the world that it is doing everything it can to make the peace process succeed. That is a much better alternative than any unilateral plan. And the reason for that, the reason that it's better, in my judgment, is what Ari said himself. The Palestinians, and I think only the Palestinians, can give Israel the legitimacy that it needs in the international arena. And therefore, only an agreement with the Palestinians in which they confer that legitimacy on Israel, whether we like it or not, that's something that's a card that they hold. Only an agreement with the Palestinians will solve the legitimacy problem, not a unilateral Israeli action of any kind, in my view. So
I think we're all in agreement that the best possible resolution would certainly be a negotiated agreement, but the discussion, of course, is about if that fails, which it has until this point, then what? As Israelis, and as Israeli public opinion and what the Israeli public will allow, then what? Okay. Natan, let's finish with you, and then we'll go to the audience, because again, I'm sure there's lots on your minds. I would like to bring you into the discussion as well.
So I'd like to add to the consensus, and absolutely, I mean, it's Israel, not just moral, but also strategic obligation to try and to turn every stone, to not just to ask for peace, to lirdov peace. But we should also acknowledge there's a big difference in what happened in Gaza. There are two big differences between Gaza and Lebanon. In Gaza, the disengagement from Gaza, there were two huge things that happened. One was an unprecedented pullout of civilians from their homes in a democratically very difficult process. It was very painful for families and for the Israeli public itself. And it was morally justified, and it was extremely important for international legitimacy. That was the essence. It also means that now in Gaza, Israel doesn't defend kindergartens. We had placed kindergartens in the middle of Gaza. And of course, pulling them out was horrific from a democratic perspective, but that was the kind of surgery that we had to do. A second thing happened in Gaza. We pulled out all the military from everywhere, including Philadelphia, including the line between Gaza and Sinai. I agree with Ari that that's not necessarily a mistake, that like a lot of people portray it. But that is the more complicated one. But I have news for you. That was the easier one, and that is the reversible one. The military is built to move. You do not need stationary military bases in Gaza. Gaza is very small. You can place them near Ashkelon. You can get in wherever you want, and the F-16 can sit in the base. The same was true, and the same can be true to a certain degree, a limited one, in the West Bank. But there are three things we must make sure if there are new unilateral moves. One is that they don't undermine the chance of the real solution and real legitimacy, which is a peace deal. And the Gaza disengagement was not planned correctly to make sure that it doesn't prevent that. The second is that we don't repeat some of the mistakes, and those have to do with security. And the West Bank is much more complicated than the Gaza Strip, both on the Eastern Front and, of course, on the hilltops, which overlook most of the Israeli population. And the third point is how we deal with it in terms of unilateralism. How coordinated it is. Is it done with Rawabis and with the coordination of the Palestinian Authority? Or is it done, as many interpreted Sharon to mean, as a snub in the face of Abu Mazen, as if it's a concession to Hamas, which brings us back to undermining the possibility of solution. All I mean to say by this is that the trauma of Gaza, which was badly packaged and is misunderstood because we're conflating two very different things that happen in Gaza, has blocked us from looking creatively at what we might do to gain the moral high ground, to speak truthfully to ourselves about what it means to truly look for a two-state solution, which would mean not building where we think we're going to pull out, and to try and also get the initiative in the international community to prove to the world what is true, which is that Israel is the just party in this story, and the problem is the Palestinian rejection. But to do that, Israel has to be creative about this and has to also have the courage to look at things that are uncomfortable in a whole menu of very uncomfortable things. None of the options are good, as I say.
Thank you very much. So, please, round of applause for our fabulous panel.
Ari, why do you advocate the creation of an Arab terrorist state in Judea and Samaria, aligned with and controlled by Iran? Is it enough that we have to deal with Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza? Now you're bringing this terrorist state to the gates of Jerusalem, Gush Dan, and Tel Aviv. You don't talk about Iran. 5 minutes after the creation of this state, Iran will be in control of it.
Thank you for the question. Ari will give you a chance to respond.
First of all, I at least try to respect my fellow humans, my fellow Jews, my fellow...
I respect you.
So let's
I respect you.
Okay.
I want an answer to my question. A straightforward answer.
I'm going to answer. I'm just to tone down...
You sit down.
Thank you for your question.
So
Please take a seat and he'll answer the question.
Let's do it in an amicable, civilized way, okay? I think that one of the most important things is Jewish unity. So let's try to do that. So I answered with one. There are 12 ways to answer your question, your good question. But I answered with one name before, and I'll answer with one name now. The one name is Iran. If we are to deal with Iran, if we are to convince the world that it should listen to us on Iran, we must change our ways in the West Bank. Never mind who is right and who is wrong, we can argue about that. But we have to recognize the fact that while the settlers won the battle for the hills, they totally lost the battle for the world. They lost. So we are now in a position where the world will not listen to our just claims about Natanz and Fordu because of Yitzhar and Itamar. This is the way things are. Never mind right or wrong, moral, not moral. Realpolitik. The settlement activity has become the main obstacle in our way of waging war, political war on Iran. So if the Prime Minister is right, and I think he's right, that Iran is existential threat number one, and if we understand that the challenge in the coming year, not in 2 years, because it won't be too late, is to win over public opinion in order to get the world attention to our just struggle against Iran, which is the most important, the real existential battle for our future, and in my mind, for the future of Western civilization. We must do something, not pull out of the entire West Bank, not go for some dramatic. We must take some action that changes the dynamics. And let me give you one example. In recent months, I'm more and more envious of two political, religious entities that I never thought I'd be envious of. One is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which I detest, and one is the Catholic Church, which I respect. Both saw the world going against them. Both saw the zeitgeist going against them. And both took action to reinvent themselves and reposition themselves. I think one is a charade and one is genuine. There's no place to compare, but both realized. Now I look at us and I wonder, can't Jews be as smart as Shiites and Catholics? It's time to wake up. We are on the edge. The ice is this thin. If we do not take action now to change our positioning in the world, in this country especially, and amongst young people especially, we are in deep trouble. So this is what I suggest. I think that exactly to fight Iran, we must take some action. Thank you very much.
Before we go to the next question, before we go to the next question, if you have anything you want to add.
Just a brief thing. The answer to the second question is the first question. Not partitioning is having the de facto one state, that the worst enemies of Israel, the people who truly hate and delegitimize it, are calling it. There's demonstrations right outside this building. That's the reality that we're facing if we don't take serious action for partition. We, the United States, we, Israel, etc. What that partition looks like, how it's prevented from being an Iranian satellite, all these things are extremely important, extremely important. They relate to things we talked about and relate to what a peace deal would look like. But taking no action and thinking that we can continue as we have been for 46 years is turning a blind eye to reality and to one of our most important battles, which is with legitimacy around the world and with legitimacy among ourselves, with the ability to say to ourselves that we have the moral high ground, as Ali mentioned earlier.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief because I know there are a lot of questions. I agree with Ari that a two-state solution is much better than a one-state solution, but I don't think it has very much to do with Iran. And I don't think that Israel's position on this issue really makes much difference to what other countries do or don't do, or what Israel does or doesn't do about the Iranian nuclear option or about Iran overall. There's no good evidence that I see that Israel's position on that question, on the West Bank, on the peace process, on the Palestinian issue, et cetera, really has much influence on Iran or on other countries' attitudes toward Iran. So I reject the idea of linkage, as it's often called, as a practical matter. And I think that in Europe, relations with Israel are in trouble because of the settlements. I saw that very well on a tour of Europe myself just a few weeks ago. I don't see it as much in the United States. General American public support for Israel is at an all-time high, as measured by the Gallup organization. It is a problem in the political class here in the United States, but not in public opinion. And on the question, a very important question that the gentleman asked just a moment ago, would a Palestinian state in the West Bank become a surrogate of Iran, as some people say the Hamas mini-state in Gaza has been or could be? I think actually the answer to that is no, and that's very important, because actually the Palestinian Authority and its security services have demonstrated, this is not a hypothetical proposition, under Mahmoud Abbas, not under Arafat, but under Abbas, that they are genuine and effective partners with Israel against Hamas and against terrorists and against the most radical forms of rejectionism that Iran represents. So I think that, again, to be uncharacteristically optimistic, I think there's actually a reasonable chance, if this is done in a not unilateral way, but in a negotiated way with the Palestinian Authority, there's a reasonable chance that their Palestinian state in the West Bank will not become a base for terrorists and rockets and Iranian pressure against Israel in the future.
I agree with you wholeheartedly with all your suggestions and the ways to bring peace. If, only if, and it's a big if, the Arab countries would have been equivalent to Israel. Israel does not have terrorists. The Arab countries have terrorists. Terrorists are the one that really, really, at the end of the day, has the say. Do you really think, David, that Mahmoud Abbas has any say? Do you think the Palestinian people have any say? No. They are all afraid of terrorism, of the terrorists. And my question to you, and it's been, I'm fighting with it all the time, for a long, long time, how come in this conference and in general, nobody talks about the empowerment and the strength of the terrorists? They are the one that if these terrorists wouldn't have been in existence, if Hamas and Hezbollah wouldn't be, then everything that you're saying will be possible. How come nobody talks about the real issue? Fear. And that is the real issue. And with this fear, I don't think we'll ever have any peace, because the Palestinian layman wants peace. Mahmoud Abbas, I'm sure, wants peace. He has no say. He's a puppet.
I understand, I think, your idea, but I just don't agree with it based on the record. Abbas and his security services are fighting against terrorists every day in cooperation with Israel, and they're succeeding. There is hardly any terrorism at all in the West Bank or from the West Bank.
They're having a hard time in the refugee camps and the Israeli forces who have to go in at night and
I said in cooperation with Israel.
Wait,
Yeah.
One question per person. One question per person, I'm so sorry.
No, he's not going to be killed, and he hasn't been killed. And the evidence, therefore, to my mind, is that he is actually able, and his own security forces are able, again, in cooperation with Israel, which is important and positive, to prevent terrorism against himself, against his own government, and also against Israel, and even against the Israeli settlers in the West Bank. This is working, and I think it could work in the future as well. It's not 100% sure, but the evidence is very strong that this is practical and effective.
Other one of you want to weigh in here? Please.
I think it's. First of all, I agree with David. I think that what you said is expression. We kept talking about it when we talked about the traumas of after Oslo and after Camp David. That's it. I talked about my own experience. So you are a walking manifestation of the traumatized Israelis, and rightly so. But I actually think that really specifically on this issue, actually the last 7 years were quite amazing, because relatively, definitely the last 2 or 3 years, we have calm. Because in the past, the excuse for not moving, for not doing anything, was that we do not take decisions or retreat under fire. Okay, so we had 7 years of calm. And what did we do with this? So I do not think that, I think that terror can be overcome. Losing the Jewish majority and losing our legitimacy cannot be overcome. We've proved to be astonishing in dealing with terror. Mm-hmm. And so this is the one, it's a hard one. It, by the way, it will be with us this way or another for a while, I suspect, but we Israelis are very good at this. It's not only our Shabak and our IDF, I think Israeli society has proved to be amazingly resilient and impressive in dealing with terror. So yes, terror is a major problem, it should not be overlooked, but that's not the major issue right now. We have to see that whatever steps we take do not bring terror back, but I think actually that's the one we can deal with and we can overcome.
Great, thank you.
In the current state of affairs, the Beit Yehudi party is gaining popularity, and even the majority of the Likud ministers are not so favorable about the negotiations. And if you listen to Naftali Bennett or those Likud ministers, they seem pretty confident that if there were a referendum on a peace deal, the Israeli people would not say yes. And they also seem confident that their constituencies are growing and that the number of pro-settler and, pro that type of ideology is actually growing among the younger generation of Israelis. So what do you think about that outlook?
the reason the Likud has become so shifted to the right is not because Israeli public opinion shifted to the right, is because Likud was experiencing a hostile takeover by a small group of settlers who took, it's not a joke, it's a very serious and very sad thing, even for people who support the ideology. Likud today is experiencing what the labor movement experienced in the 60s and 70s in Britain when it was overtaken by Trotskyists. There are so many Likud members who don't vote Likud. Now, I'm not no Likudnik, but Likud is a very deep, important movement in Israel, and it's disappearing. I mean, the old Likud is disappearing, not because Israeli public opinion changed, but because the mechanism of Israeli politics is so distorted, and a very small group of settlers actually took over. So the settlers had two parties in the last elections. Believe me, they don't have that much support in public opinion.
Although polls show that if there were elections held today, that the current Likud Beitenu would get an additional 15 seats?
But what I'm saying, well, it depends. Look, Netanyahu has, I'm saying, if Netanyahu if he means what he says, and he goes for a kind of real Likud, he breaks from what happened, and by the way, it even might happen with Lieberman, to everybody's surprise. I think that kind of party will get Sharon kind of support. I mean, Israeli public opinion is not, Israeli politics is so distorted that the Knesset does not represent the real mood of the people. There is a real difference. We are not a Feiglin nation. We are not a Feiglin nation. We are very different. But to the degree there is a move to the right, it is the failure, total, in my mind, two failures. It's the failure of the center-left to come up with a reasonable leader. As I say, don't give me a Ben-Gurion. Give me a Tony Blair or a Bill Clinton. We didn't produce a reasonable leader for the center-left since Rabin. That's one thing. And two, bring me the new relevant idea. Just like Clinton in this country and Blair in Britain revived left-wing, sort of moderate, centrist politics by addressing the fact that the other side has a point, and you have to revive the Democratic Party here, the Labour in Britain, and then they won big time. The Israeli center-left is intellectually lazy. And by the way, the same applies to the international community. We've seen these processes that we talked about, of the failures time after time, and we've learned nothing. I'm sure that if the Israeli public will be faced with a combination of a reasonable peace concept that addresses reality as it is, a reasonable Israeli leadership that is worthy of the center-left, and a reasonable international community that shows Israelis that it really stands by them, if the world will prove to Israelis that it loves Israel, it is committed to Israel, and it will stand by Israel if it takes some risks, then you will see a major shift to the kind of centrist, center-left positions in Israel.
And Natan, I know you're in the process of writing a book that I think touches on a lot of this, so if you weigh in, that'd be great.
So I'd start with the question, is the United States moving left or right in politics? And what you'd find is that the Democratic Party is feeling pretty good about its future demographically and otherwise in presidential elections. But if you ask most people what Congress looks like, it looks much, or at least sections of it, are far more right-wing than they used to be in the past, and in interesting new ways. And I think a very similar thing happened in Israel. For all the talk of the movement to the right in Israel, the political movement to the right, Netanyahu won the last election with a bloc that essentially had 61 out of 120. In other words, just a bare majority. It's not that the opposition is one bloc, it's not, but if you look at the center-left, they got 59 votes, including Kadima. And this is extremely similar to previous results of many previous elections, going all the way back even in 92. Yitzhak Rabin basically won with 61, which statistically speaking is almost the same as Netanyahu, 59 to 61. It's the same thing. Of course, a lot of demographics have changed. There's been a big immigration from Russia, etc., but from the Soviet Union. But what you have, in other words, is a political system that is surprisingly stable, actually. A shift of ideas to the left, where the median voter is probably very close to Netanyahu right now, speaks of a two-state solution, something that Rabin never did. And a deep change on the right in areas that are not necessarily about the Palestinian issue, that have something to do with rule of law, with social norms, and things that are very different. Just like today, the changes on the right in the United States have to do with issues that are quite different than the previous conversation. And in that situation, you get, as Ali mentioned, a Likud in which names like Begin and Meridor, the fathers of whom were the two most important leaders of the Likud in the beginning, Menachem Begin and Meridor was his closest aide, their sons can get elected in the Likud, and not because they're too leftist. Meridor might be too leftist, Begin is to the right of most Likudniks on the Palestinian issue. But on other issues of rule of law, of social justice, of democracy, there he fell to some on anarchist left in the eyes of the fake Likud. And so you have a very anomalous situation. Part of it is just idiosyncratic to the Likud. Part of it is deeper changes, but they do not reflect a situation in which the center-left is just hopeless for the future. They got 59 in the last elections. With a viable leader, they could definitely win the next elections. It's not the left wing, it's not Meretz taking over, but let's remember, Rabin wasn't Meretz. Rabin looked like the center in Israel today. He was a general, he was a tough general, etc. In other words, a lot has changed in the substrata, much less has changed actually if you look at the big numbers.
Great, thanks. Next question.
It seems to me like the position that the Israeli government takes is we can't get to where we need to be with the Palestinians. Now the world can make up its mind as to whether we're good guys or bad guys. There's this big discussion that the Israelis are largely kept out of, and a large portion of the world then casts the Israelis as bad guys. I'm not sure why we can't bring the world in and negotiate more with the U.S. and Europe and say, hey, these are our positions, they're eminently reasonable, and we're completely transparent.
I for one totally agree. I mean, when I was talking about my concept of sophisticated unilateralism, that was it. To have, and that's one of the lessons to be learned from the mistakes that were done in Gaza, to get international support and legitimacy for whatever line Israel withdraws to at every moment. This is exactly should be the deal. And by the way, if we cannot get the Jewish state recognized by the Palestinians at this point, we must get it from the international community. I do think that it's true on merit. I think that our relationship with the world is such that we should demand of the world, the international community, to stand by us when we do this journey without a partner. And it's also very important because this is what will turn will open Israeli hearts to support it. Because if Israelis are skeptic about the region, about our neighbors, they do want to be part of the West. And if the West proves to them that it's making peace with the West, so to speak, rather than peace with the region, it has much more political chances.
To what extent can Israel's legitimacy problem be fixed by a peace deal, and to what extent is it ever present regardless of the facts on the ground?
There's both. There's a lot of people out there who hate Israel just because they hate Israel. There's also some anti-Semitism involved. There's all the vile stuff out there. But I said this yesterday in another panel. We make a terrible, terrible mistake if we push people who might disagree with Israel or criticize Israel for legitimate reasons, right or wrong. They may be very wrong in their criticism, but it doesn't come from a blind hatred place. If we push them into the hands of those who are simply delegitimizing Israel. If we let people who criticize Israel because out of concern for the two-state solution, and in their mind Israel isn't doing enough, right or wrong, into the hands of those who don't even want a Jewish state at all and want some kind of one state, in other words, the annihilation of Israel. We mustn't push those into the hands of others. If there were a peace deal, and if everything calmed down, the Middle East would be great, it would still be a very, very difficult situation there. It would be a difficult region. There would be a lot of people who would still hate Israel. Nothing would be rosy. And the IDF would still have to be very strong 20, 50 years down the line. But Israel's situation would be very different. It would be far better. I'll put it a little differently. People will still hate Israel. But the question is how many people wake up in the morning and their number one agenda is how do I hurt Israel? There are many people who don't like other countries. There are countries that Israel doesn't like, in Europe, say. There are countries that many Jews don't like in Europe. But do they wake up in the morning and think, how do I hurt those countries right now? No. That should be the very modest, disappointing aspiration for Israelis. Get out of the news. Get out of the top agenda of hatred. They still won't like us. There are anti-Semites out there. There will be in 100 years. This is the sad news. The good news, they might have other problems. And if we stay out of the front lines just a little bit more, our situation would be much, much better. That's my view.
All right.
I agree.
I'm actually much more optimistic than what I just heard about the long-term and even the short-term implications of peace. And the reason for that is I look at the evidence. I look at what happened after the Oslo agreements were signed 20 years ago. Instantaneously, countries, important countries like China or India, that weren't willing to deal with Israel openly before became not just willing to deal with it, but very important economic and strategic partners for Israel. And countries in Africa, less important perhaps, but still not trivial. And Arab countries and Muslim countries that weren't willing to deal, at least not openly, with Israel, were willing to do that immediately after the Oslo agreements were signed. And so I think that a peace deal with the Palestinians would confer very, very significant and very quick, important benefits for Israel in terms of its legitimacy, but more than that, in terms of its economic potential and in terms of its security.
As a college student, I feel the generational difference between opinions, and I think that's partially because we haven't necessarily experienced the trauma that maybe hardened other Israelis and Jewish Americans. But I'm wondering how to combat whether or not the peace negotiations fail, how to combat this moral high or low ground, and what I can be doing, on my campus, or what Israel can be doing to really promote the moral high ground.
It is important for Israel to be able to show that it has made reasonable offers for peace, and that it continues to do that, and to demonstrate by its actions that those offers are genuine. And I think that maybe the single most important fact that needs to be repeated to audiences of any generation anywhere in the world is that in 2000 and again in 2008, the Israeli government offered the Palestinians almost complete withdrawal from the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And that offer was either rejected or not accepted. And so that moral high ground, I think, needs to continue to be, and in a very genuine way, the kind of explanation or account of Israel's policy that we can offer with a clear conscience and in good faith to people who question Israel's policy or even Israel's basic legitimacy.
I'd say, and I think this relates to a lot of things we're talking about, and it relates to the way Israelis look at it too, to public opinion. I think the key is simply to be true to ourselves and brutally honest with ourselves, because the honest answer and the truth are actually very much in our favor. But that includes complexity. It includes saying, for example, that Israel, and now even Netanyahu, to everyone's surprise previously, supports the two-state solution and is willing to go very far to achieve it. And that entails also that includes strategic decisions for everything else. It includes not continuing to build in areas that Israel intends to pull out of. This is a complex message. It's not simple to do in a I love Israel, I hate Israel conversation, which is why we should not be striving for those conversations at all. What we should approach instead, I think, is with much more self-assuredness. Israel doesn't need to prove that it has a right to exist. Israel exists, period. It's a member of the United Nations. It has a population. Deal with it. Like it or not, deal with it. And starting from there, Israel's actions, Israel's aspirations for the future are complex, like every single country. They should be more consistent. We can also call for more consistency. But that should not blind our eyes to where Israel is often right, and to Israel's strategic options. In other words, I think what we need to do is not to engage so much in this conversation, which to my mind displays even a weakness of as if Israel needs to prove that it has a right to exist. That should not even be a question. That is why the demand for the Palestinians is a just one, although whether smart or not, is a just one, because we do not need to have to prove our right to exist to anyone. Finland has a right to exist. California has a right to exist. And if you look at the history of California, I used to live there, so I can say it, it's not necessarily that much prettier than the history of Israel. It has a right to exist. Starting from there, our conversation can be much more honest, much more self-assured, can also include complexities of where Israel is, what it might do, what it might change. And you know what? It would also reflect an extreme complexity in the public opinion of Israel itself and of the crazy politics of Israel themselves, which are very complex, disagree with each other, and change course often. And in that environment, I think our conversation, even with a new generation that is very idealistic but is just as smart as previous generations, that conversation can be much better than we fear.
Ari, thoughts for the other Ari and closing thoughts?
You asked the question, right? I'm very happy for this question. I think this is the real debate. I mean, what we discussed, I think the real debate, what we discussed is very important, but this is as important and perhaps even more important. Look, I was aware of it before, but I've been around American universities in the last 2 months. And it's very, very troubling. And what's more troubling is that the Israeli establishment doesn't get it, and some of the Jewish establishment doesn't get it. People heard about it, they don't internalize it. What you said is so, so true. And let me say it in a very simple way. People over 70, have the Holocaust in their context, and they are, by Israel, right or wrong, adamantly. People over 30 have pre-67 Israel in their mind, so they might complain and moan and criticize. They cannot help it. They're with Israel. People under 30 are in a different world. And they're in a different world because of two reasons. One, it is because the Israel they are experiencing is Israel of occupation, settlements, and ultra-Orthodox politics. Never mind true or not true, this is what they experience. So on the one, they live in a kind of, or you live in a kind of split screen. On the one hand, they have birthright, they have Startup Nation, they have the Tel Aviv thing. But on the other hand, when they go back to their campuses and they confront their peers, they have no tools, they have no concepts, they don't have the basic knowledge, they don't have the basic ability to deal with the political issue. And what Israel and the Jewish establishment has been doing is to ignore the elephant in the room. It's a huge elephant. And the essence of the elephant is the following. The young people of America are universalists. They have universal values and they care mainly about social justice. Israel is being more and more perceived as a tribal entity. Sometimes it is perceived as a human rights violator. So they live in a terrible contrast. And I cannot repeat to you the heartbreaking conversations I had with dozens, if not hundreds of students. And it's time for us, all the grown-ups, the establishment, the Israelis, to wake up. This is the most important challenges facing us. It's more important than Israel's military problems. It's time to change our ways, to change our rhetoric, and to go out there on an offensive, a love offensive, to win hearts and minds of young people in this country. This is the most important battle of all.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.